Hello, my name is Bev Lutkemeyer, and I'm a compliance supervisor for the Division of Special Education with the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was reauthorized and signed into law on December 3, 2004, and final federal regulations were published on August 14, 2006. After publication of the final federal regulations, the state of Missouri revised state regulations and the Compliance Program Review Standards and Indicators Manual and numerous model forms. This presentation, Keys to Postsecondary Transition Planning, is one in a series of trainings to inform the field of the major changes in state and federal regulations and the implementing changes made in the Compliance Standards and Indicators Manual and on the state model forms. We hope you enjoy this series of trainings and find the information useful in your role as an educator, parent, advocate, or other individual interested in the education of children with disabilities. Other topics in this series are Discipline for Children with Disabilities, Special Education Data Collection and Reporting Overview, Finance of Special Education, the Special Education Process, and Changes in IDEA, the Special Education Complaint Process, Administration of Special Education, Response to Intervention, Early Intervening Services. Resources and handouts for each of the presentations in the series can be found at the website shown on the screen. We encourage you to obtain the documents for this presentation prior to viewing. The Division of Special Education welcomes questions that participants may have after viewing the presentations. Questions can be submitted to the mailbox shown or by calling the Division of Special Education at 573-751-0699. IDEA 2004 made several changes in the requirements for post-secondary transition planning for students with disabilities. Since the reauthorization, the Office of Special Education Programs, Federal Technical Assistance Centers, and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education Division of Special Education have been developing numerous resources to assist individuals involved with the transition planning process for youth with disabilities. These resources are intended to assist transition planning teams in meeting all required transition compliance standards, as well as to develop a quality transition plan that will enable youth with disabilities to reach their post-secondary goal. The purpose of this training is to cover the changes in post-secondary transition that resulted from the reauthorization of the IDEA in December of 2004, define terms that are commonly used in association with post-secondary transition, discuss the state performance plan goals that relate to post-secondary transition, familiarize the viewer with the compliance requirements for post-secondary transition planning, and identify tools and resources for districts and IEP transition teams to assist them in developing compliant and effective transition plans. Before we begin, you may want to collect the items shown on the screen, as we will be referring to them as we go through the presentation. All of these documents can be downloaded from the website shown. Understanding the definition of transition services is the first step to understanding the process of transition planning for youth with disabilities. Transition services are defined in the federal regulations in Section 300.43. According to the federal regulations, transition services means a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that is designed within a results-oriented process, focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing and adult education, adult services, independent living, community participation, and is based on the individual child's needs, taking into account the child's strengths, preferences, and interests, and includes instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and if appropriate, the acquisition of daily living skills and provision of a functional vocational evaluation. Transition services may be special education if provided as specially designed instruction or a related service if required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. There are some key words in the definition. The first term is post-school activities. It's important to remember that when we're talking about transition for high school youth with disabilities, we're talking about transition from school to post-school activities, or what the child will be doing after high school, either after graduation with a regular diploma or aging out of the system at age 21. The next terms are coordinated set of activities and results-oriented process. It is very important that the activities identified for the child's transition plan be coordinated and that they are focused on an end result, the child's post-secondary goal or goals. Last is the part of the definition that requires the plan be based on child's needs and their strengths, preferences, and interests. This will be particularly important when we talk about the requirement that the plan be based on age-appropriate transition assessments. The preamble to the IDEA lists a number of things that Congress believed were important when they drafted the law. Many of those have to do with preparing students with disabilities for the future, for education, training, employment, and independent living. Statistics show that individuals with disabilities are less likely than their non-disabled peers to be employed or continuing their education 1 year after graduation. Effective transition planning can help close this gap by helping youth with disabilities develop an effective plan for their future. When youth with disabilities have a well-designed transition plan, they can, with our help, successfully reach their goals. While many things have improved for youth with disabilities over the past few years, there are still a number of areas in which they are not achieving outcomes comparable to their non-disabled peers. Effective transition planning can have a significant impact on assisting youth with disabilities to achieve better post-school outcomes and to lead productive and independent lives. Another reason why transition planning is important has to do with the Missouri State Special Education Performance Plan, SPP, and the Annual Performance Report, APR. IDEA 2004 required each state to develop a state performance plan covering 20 performance indicators. This was completed in December of 2005. Each year on February 1st, the state must submit an annual performance report on how the state is progressing toward meeting the targets in the SPP. In addition, the state must report publicly its own performance as well as the performance of each public agency on meeting the targets. Information regarding the SPP and APR can be found on the DESI website at the address shown on the screen. Each agency's report for performance on the SPP indicators can be found with the agency's report card on the DESI website. As you can see, 14 of the 20 indicators apply directly to districts. Of those 14, 4 address post-secondary transition. Those are indicators 1, 2, 13, and 14. Indicator number 1 addresses graduation. The goal is to increase the percent of youth with disabilities graduating with a regular diploma. Indicator number 2 addresses dropouts. The goal is to decrease the percent of youth with disabilities dropping out of school. Data for measuring these 2 indicators are collected annually through core data. Indicator number 13 addresses the transition plans that are in students' IEPs. This is basically a compliance indicator and looks to see that IEPs for youth age 16 and up contain a transition plan, that the plan has measurable goals and transition services that will reasonably enable the child to reach their post-secondary goal. Data for this indicator are collected through the Special Education Monitoring Process as part of a district's Missouri School Improvement Program, or MSIP, review. Indicator 14 addresses post-secondary outcomes and looks at the percent of youth with disabilities that are employed, enrolled in post-secondary training or education, or both, within 1 year of leaving high school. Data for this indicator are collected annually through core data. By developing and implementing compliant and effective transition plans for youth with disabilities, IEP teams can have a significant positive effect on the above indicators, both within the local district and in the state as a whole. The next thing we want to address are the regulatory requirements for post-secondary transition. The state and federal regulations include requirements for post-secondary transition in a number of places. We'll discuss each area separately. Let's look at what's required for the IEP content in transition planning. First, the child's IEP must include a transition plan by the time the child turns 16. This may be done by either developing a transition plan to be included in the IEP that will be in effect during the year that the child will turn 16, or you can convene the IEP team prior to the child's 16th birthday to develop the transition plan. Many of you will note that IDEA 2004 made a change in the requirement for the age at which transition planning was required to be done. Prior to IDEA 2004, the mandatory age was 14. IDEA 2004 changed that mandatory age to 16. However, the law and regulations continued to leave in the wording or younger if determined appropriate by the IEP team. Best practice tells us that for many, if not most or even all youth with disabilities, beginning to plan for their post-high school activities should begin well before their 16th birthday. However, this would be a decision of the IEP team. Next, the child's transition plan must be reviewed and revised if determined necessary, at least annually. The content for the transition plan must include at least one measurable post-secondary goal for education or training, employment, and independent living if appropriate. The goals must be based on age-appropriate transition assessments that have been conducted in the areas of training, education, employment, and independent living skills. Finally, the transition plan must identify the transition services that the child will need to enable them to meet their post-secondary goal. The services can be in one or more of the following areas: instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and, if appropriate, the acquisition of daily living skills and provision of a functional vocational evaluation. Also included with the transition services, the IEP must include the courses of study that the child will need to reach their goals. Another piece of IEP content relates to the requirement that the IEP include a statement that at least 1 year before the child reaches the age of majority, in Missouri that's at age 18, that the child has been informed of the rights that will transfer to him or her upon reaching the age of 18, unless guardianship has been awarded by a court of competent jurisdiction. Basically, unless guardianship has been awarded, all rights previously afforded to the parent will transfer to the child. The next area in which post-secondary transition is mentioned is the IEP team. In addition to all of the other required participants in an IEP meeting, when post-secondary transition is a purpose of the meeting, the public agency must invite the child to attend. Also, when appropriate, the agency must invite representatives of any participating agency that may be responsible for providing or paying for transition services. It's important to remember that before these representatives are invited, written consent must be obtained from the parent or the child if they have reached the age of majority. The regulations address the content of the notification that is sent home for the IEP meeting. When post-secondary transition is going to be addressed in an IEP meeting, the notification must state that consideration of post-secondary goals and transition services is one purpose for the meeting. The notification must state that the student will be invited to attend, and it must identify any other agency that will be invited to send a representative to the meeting. This last requirement will only need to be met if the parent or student has given written consent for the public agency to invite a representative of another agency. The next area addresses what is to happen if another public agency fails to provide or pay for transition services that are identified in the child's IEP. It is important to remember that in the transition plan, unlike most other areas of the IEP, there may be agencies other than the public agency that have been identified to provide and pay for some of the transition services. However, the public agency, generally the public school district, is still the responsible agency for ensuring that all provisions in the IEP are implemented. For this reason, if another agency fails to provide the transition services, the responsible public agency needs to reconvene the Iep team and identify alternative strategies to meet the child's transition objectives. The rule stated on this slide speaks to responsibilities of other agencies for providing services to transition-age youth. It simply states that those agencies must meet their obligations to provide and/or pay for any transition services required of their agency, even though the youth is also receiving transition services through an IEP under the IDEA. The National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center has developed a checklist to use as a tool to help states collect data for State Performance Plan Indicator 13, commonly known as the Spp Indicator 13 checklist. As was stated earlier, Indicator 13 is a compliance indicator that measures the percent of youth aged 16 or above whose IEPs include coordinated, measurable annual IEP goals and transition services that will reasonably enable the student to meet their post-secondary goals. This is data that the state is accountable for and must report to the U.S. Department of Education annually. It is data for which school districts in the state are also accountable. The Indicator 13 checklist addresses 6 essential components of transition planning. Missouri is using the NSTTAC checklist as a tool for monitoring IEPs for compliance and effective post-secondary transition plans. Local districts can use the Indicator 13 checklist to ensure that their transition plans are compliant and will reasonably enable high school youth with disabilities to achieve their post-secondary goals. Let's go through the checklist questions. The post-secondary transition plan must include a statement of what the child will do after graduation from high school in the areas of education or training, employment, and if needed, independent living. This statement or goal must be written in measurable terms. What do we have to do to make sure that we write transition plans that include measurable post-secondary goals in the appropriate goal areas? We have to prepare children to make decisions about their own futures. We must help children learn about their own strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. In doing so, we will learn the information that we need to write an effective transition plan. Ideally, the Iep team should begin talking with children about transition planning well before they turn 16. Family involvement is critical to learn about a child. Parents are a valuable resource for transition planning because often they have already been talking with the child about their future, and they know about the child's strengths, needs, preferences, and interests. Transition assessment is also a valuable tool. Teams can use both formal and informal assessment to learn about the child's aptitudes and abilities. Don't forget about transition planning when it's time for the child's triennial reevaluation. Consider whether any formal transition assessment is needed when a child who is involved in or will soon begin transition planning is being reevaluated. Formal assessment can be completed as part of the triennial reevaluation process. Be sure to think ahead so that you have time to gather any information that you'll need for transition planning before it's time for the annual IEP meeting. At the meeting, make sure you use measurable language when you write the goals. Make sure you are writing a goal that will occur after graduation. It's okay to use STEM statements such as after graduation to begin the goals. What does this look like on the IEP? The state sample IEP, Form C, is the form on which the post-secondary transition plan is documented. Form C has 3 sections. The first section of Form C is for the combined areas of education and training. Write the education and our training goal or goals in the first box next to the phrase post-secondary goal. As mentioned before, the goal can begin with a STEM statement, such as upon graduation. Remember, the action or outcome must be something that will occur after the child leaves high school, and the goal must be measurable. The post-secondary goals for employment and independent living will go in the same location in their respective sections of Form C. For each post-secondary goal, there must be at least one annual IEP goal in the IEP that will help the student make progress toward the stated post-secondary goal. This does not necessarily mean that there must be separate annual IEP goals for each post-secondary goal, but the annual goals should relate to the post-secondary goals. Reaching the annual goals should help the child progress toward the post-secondary goals. What will this look like in the IEP? Look at the annual goal page of the State Sample Form IEP. Find the phrase, "For students with post-secondary transition plans, please indicate which goal domain this annual goal will support," and check the box or boxes for the appropriate post-secondary goal domain. A measurable annual IEP goal may be related to more than one post-secondary goal domain area. Check the box for the appropriate goal domain area for each annual measurable IEP goal. Checklist question 3 asks if there are transition services in the IEP that focus on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child to facilitate movement from school to post-school. This is a listing of different types of transition services, including examples. Dr. Ed O'Leary's Transition Outcomes Program training is the source for these examples. The first type of transition service is instruction. An example is instruction in self-advocacy. The next type of transition service is related services. An example is mobility training and orientation from school, home, work, church, and community sites. The next type of transition service is community experience. An example is assist the child to identify appropriate recreational activities at the recreation center or YMCA. The next type of transition service is development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. An example is teach the child appropriate behaviors and skills for the workplace. The next type of transition service is acquisition of daily living skills. An example is teach the child to purchase items at a variety of stores. The final type of transition service is provision of a functional vocational evaluation if appropriate. An example is develop a vocational profile based on functional information. There should be at least one transition service that is designed to help the child meet each post-secondary goal. Transition services can be provided at school, at home, or in the community. Transition services can be provided by a teaching professional, a parent, or a transition specialist, just to name a few. Our transition services can be self-directed by the student. How do we include transition services in the transition plan? Think about what skills the child will need to develop in or out of the classroom in order to reach the post-secondary goals. Provide transition services that will help the child develop those necessary skills. Think about connections that the child will need to make in order to reach the goals. Provide transition services that will help them make those connections. This is where preparation will pay off. If you've done your homework, that means appropriate transition assessment. You will already have a pretty good idea of what the child knows and can do and what he or she will need to learn to do in order to reach the post-secondary goals. When you know this, you will be able to determine what transition services the child will need. What will this look like in the IEP? Form C has a section to record the transition services for each post-secondary goal in its respective section. List services in the right-hand column next to the person or agency responsible for providing each service. This is an example of how a transition service will look on Form C. Transition services will be listed in the Transition Services section appropriate for each post-secondary goal. The column on the left labeled Responsible Agency/Person lists parties who may be responsible for providing a transition service or services to help the child progress toward the above-mentioned post-secondary goal. You will list the transition service in the right column labeled Transition Service, next to the person or agency that is responsible for providing the service. For example, a transition service that consists of the child receiving instruction on how to compose an essay to be included with a college application will be listed in the Education/Training section of Form C. The person responsible for provision of the transition service would be the child's communication arts and special education teachers. The transition service could be described as assistance with completing college applications. Here's an example of what the Education or Training section of Form C may look like for a college-bound student. The services and courses of study included in this section are those designed to help him reach his goal of earning a bachelor's degree in drafting and design. Here's an example of what the Employment section of Form C may look like for a college-bound student. The services and courses of study included in this section are those designed to help him reach his goal of getting a job as a draftsman. Checklist question 4. For transition services that are likely to be provided or paid for by other agencies with parent or child once the age of majority is reached, consent, is there evidence that the representatives of the agencies were invited to the IEP meeting? Consider whether there are any transition services that are likely to be provided or paid for by an outside agency. Before inviting a representative from another agency, you must obtain consent for release of personally identifiable information, either from the parents or the child who has reached the age of majority. After obtaining consent, you will contact a representative of the outside agency and invite the representative to the IEP meeting to participate in transition planning. How do we know if it's appropriate to invite other agencies? Know the child and what services are needed to reach the post-secondary goals. Know what agencies are in your community and surrounding area and what services they provide or pay for. Match the child's needs to services that will help meet those needs. For example, a child who wants to be competitively employed after high school may need a functional vocational assessment. This can be provided to students who qualify by vocational rehabilitation services. After obtaining consent for release of information, you will contact VR and begin the referral process. What does this look like in the student's file? When it's appropriate to invite representatives of other agencies, the meeting notice must indicate that these representatives were invited to attend the meeting. The state sample meeting notice has a place to list the name and role of the agency representative. The student's file must contain a copy of the signed consent for release of personally identifiable information that was provided by the parent or the child if he or she has reached the age of majority. The consent form must document that consent was provided prior to the date of the meeting invitation. If a representative of an outside agency is identified to provide a transition service, that transition service must be listed on Form C in the appropriate section for the post-secondary goal it is supporting. The service must be listed in the Transition Services section in the row that indicates that the outside agency is responsible for its provision. If the other agency fails to provide or pay for the transition services, the Iep team must be reconvened to address alternative strategies for ensuring that the child's transition needs are addressed. The current state sample meeting notification also includes a checkbox in which to document that the child was invited to the Iep meeting. Checking this box means that the child was given a copy of the meeting notification or was verbally invited and notified of the time, place, and purpose of the meeting. IDEA 2004 requires that the measurable post-secondary goal or goals be based on age-appropriate transition assessment. There must be documentation of the assessments that were administered either in the IEP or in the child's file. Age appropriate means that the assessment reflects a child's chronological age rather than the developmental age. There are two basic types of transition assessment, formal and informal assessment. Formal transition assessments have been tested for reliability and validity and may include standardized assessments. The resources for this presentation contain a listing of some of the more commonly used formal transition assessments. Informal assessments can include anything that helps the IEP team clarify the student's post-secondary goals and needed transition services. Common informal assessments include personal interviews conducted with the child or the parent, surveys, behavior observations, situational assessments, rating scales, curriculum-based assessments, checklists, person-centered planning, environmental assessments, or medical appraisal. It's important that you begin your transition assessments early enough so that the information is available for the IEP team to use when developing the first IEP to be in place when the child turns 16. You also need to look at what assessments need to be done at least annually as you talk about transition planning annually once the child reaches age 16. Be sure to think about the use of the triennial reevaluation that occurs closest but prior to the child's 16th birthday to assess what kind of formal or informal transition assessment is needed. If any formal assessment is needed, it can be done as part of the reevaluation process at that time. If you follow this practice, you should have useful transition assessment information available when it comes time to write the IEP that will be in effect when the child turns 16. Don't forget that you will need to get consent prior to administering any individual formal assessment. Individual formal assessment should be conducted in the context of a reevaluation. Your school district may be conducting transition assessment for all students at certain grade levels. Be sure to talk to your district's guidance department to see what types of transition assessment they do and when they do it, and to ask for copies of the results so that you may use this information for transition planning as well. Some examples of commonly administered assessment that are available to all students are the Cooter Interest Inventory, the Plan Test, and the ASVAB. What does this look like in the IEP? The use of age-appropriate transition assessment should be documented in the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. The state sample IEP form contains a prompt for documenting the results of age-appropriate transition assessment. Checklist question 6 focuses on the requirement that the transition services include courses of study that improves the academic and functional achievement of the child to facilitate their movement from school to post-school. We get lots of questions about the course of study. Storms, O'Leary, and Williams have defined courses of study as a multi-year description of coursework necessary to achieve the student's desired post-school goals. Again, planning is critical. The child and IEP team must work closely with the school guidance counselor to make sure that the student is enrolling in classes that will enable him to graduate and help him reach his post-secondary goals. Each child should have a 4-year plan. It may be necessary to revise this plan over the course of a child's secondary education as interests and plans for the future may change. It's important that the IEP team know what classes the child will be taking during the semesters that the IEP will be in effect and which post-secondary goals each class is supporting. It's also important that the child's special education teacher and/or case manager keep in close communication with the child's guidance counselor to be sure that the course of study is being taken by the student. If critical courses are added, or more importantly, dropped from the student's course of study, this is a time when the IEP team needs to know and reconsider the child's transition plan. What will this look like in the IEP? Form C has a place to list the courses of study that are supporting each post-secondary goal domain area. You can either list the appropriate courses for each domain area in the appropriate section for each domain area, or you can attach a 4-year plan that lists the specific courses that support the post-secondary goals. Even when you attach a 4-year plan, you may find it necessary to list some courses on Form C. This will be the case if the 4-year plan only lists classes in which the child is earning required credits for graduation. For example, if a child is receiving transition services in study skills class, but study skills class isn't listed on the 4-year plan, then study skills class should be listed on Form C. In conclusion, I want to leave you with a list of resources. Coming soon, Missouri will have an online post-secondary transition training module developed by the University of Kansas Transition Coalition. This will be a great resource for school districts, as it will present a very well-rounded approach to meaningful, effective transition planning. The module is being developed to meet Missouri's needs and standards for post-secondary transition planning. As always, read the special education listserv messages so that you will be informed of any updates as soon as possible. If you are not the primary SELS recipient at your district, you can be included on the SELS 2 listserv and receive the same SELS messages in the same time frame. You can sign up for SELS 2 on the DESE Special Education Division homepage. Attend training on various post-secondary transition topics offered at your regional professional development center. Call DESE Special Education Compliance when you have questions. Thank you for your interest in post-secondary transition planning, and good luck to you and your students.